From the gridiron to the hardwood, James Mesh breaks it all down. It's time for another episode of Cleats and Sneaks.
Free agency is running wild first couple of days in, and I'm here for it. Welcome into another edition of Cleats and Sneaks. I'm your host, James Mesh, where we talk about everything going on in the NFL and the NBA. Man, and there's plenty to talk about with the NFL as we recently got into the start of free agency and the new league year. And since then, we've had over 200 signings and trades, whether it was the teams getting new players or they were just able to re-sign with their old guys, but plenty of action to talk about. A lot of implications and wonderings of what's going to happen when it comes to some of the guys in fantasy football. We'll talk about on this edition of Cleats and Sneaks, but man, to start off with a couple of heavy hitters, some of the top free agent signings that have gone on so far. Saquon Barkley, he decided to go from the New York Giants to be their starting running back to their rival in the NFC East, to the Philadelphia Eagles, and he signed a 3-year, $37.75 million contract. $26 million is guaranteed. That's absolutely phenomenal. It's so funny to watch that. And then Kirk Cousins, we were wondering, is he going to stay in Minnesota? Is he going to go somewhere else to maybe the Falcons? Well, he did just that. He decides to go to Atlanta for a 4-year, $180 million contract. $50 million of that is going to be a signing bonus. And this is interesting because he's a 36-year-old quarterback that's coming off an ACL tear. His agent needs to be in the Hall of Fame based off of what he was able to do earlier this week and what's going on in those contracts with Minnesota, how he's able to get fully guaranteed contract deals with them. What is this guy? I need him as my agent to discuss my contracts. Where do I call him? But no, seriously, I know it looks bad because of the implications of his age and the injury that Kirk Cousins has and what he's dealing with right now, but this is a significant upgrade from what they had before with Desmond Ridder. I know it's weird, and I know the back half of the contract looks really bad because you would be paying him $57.5 million for those final 2 years each, not a total each. But look, that's just the market that it is for quarterbacks nowadays. You basically saw something similar, not as significant, but something similar with Derek Carr last year when he was the top free agent quarterback and he signed with the New Orleans Saints. Like, that's just what happens. You put so many of your eggs nowadays into the quarterback basket when it comes to cap. And plus, here's the thing. Later on, even though you're basically going to be financially tied to him, whether you like his play or not, unless you just want to go the Russell Wilson Denver Broncos route and you just straight up cut him, you're going to be tied to him anyway, but you can always convert a bunch of that salary into a signing bonus. That way it's not as much hindrance on your salary cap and you'll still be able to sign some other free agents. But it was interesting because both of those contracts were potential tampering situations because they talked to the teams weeks ahead of time of the legal tampering period, which is weird to me because why are we even having a legal tampering period? What does it matter? Find that one very interesting because who cares? Saquon, if he was likely going to leave anyway, even though the report said that he was thinking about going back to the Giants, but Philly offered something that the Giants just couldn't offer, and he just went with the deal. And then Kirk deciding to go to Atlanta, probably just over being in Minnesota, needed a new change of scenery. Not quite sure, but still two pretty good signings. I know the numbers don't look great with Kirk, especially in the back half, but overall really good, especially with what they had before. Significant upgrades, of course. Russell Wilson, he also signed with Pittsburgh on a veteran minimum deal of 1 year because the other $38 million Denver is paying. So maybe we see that's what happens with Atlanta years down the road on the final couple years of that contract or whatever. But only time will tell. Of course, a lot of the other quarterback market movement that had happened, a lot of them were backups. Of course, Mac Jones got traded to the Jaguars. Drew Lock goes to the Giants. Gardner Minshew, I know we had talked about him before. he got himself a little bit of cash. He got a 2-year deal signing with the Raiders. However, you're wondering, okay, well, if he's moving on to Vegas, James, well, who's going to be the backup for Anthony Richardson? Because he did have a couple of pretty big injuries, and he only played a couple of games in his rookie season. Despite him looking really good, you still need to make sure that you invest into the backup quarterback in case your quarterback does get injured and an injury does arise. Well, they liked what they saw to Joe Flacco in Cleveland and said, come on down, bud. We'll make you our backup. Plenty of other guys moving as well. Nathan Peterman, one of the 2 signings for the New Orleans Saints so far. He's going to be there, as well as Willie Gay, former linebacker for the Kansas City Chiefs. They signed him to a 1-year deal up to $5 million. Desmond Ridder, we talked about him before. He's getting traded from Atlanta to go to the Arizona Cardinals, and in return, Atlanta got Rondale Moore. One of 2 moves they made in the wide receiver room, because they did move on from Matt Collins, but they were able to sign former Chicago Bear wide receiver Darnell Mooney. So you have Kirk Cousins, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Bijan Robinson, plus you have Darnell Mooney as your wide receiver 2 and Rondale Moore as your wide receiver 3. Plus you have a good offensive line, and the defense does not look too bad either. Jesse Bates was an absolute phenomenal signing for them last year. Could work on that defensive line a little bit, but still, they have Grady Jarrett, who still looks pretty good. And Calais Campbell's on his last legs, but we'll see what happens there. Still overall looking really good. And in my eyes, as much as I don't like saying it, Atlanta is likely the betting favorite to win the NFC South this upcoming season. Quite a few different moves as well. You saw a lot of movement in the interior offensive line market because a lot of the top guys, offensive line prospects, are at the tackle position. That's why you've only seen a couple here and there get moved. But a lot of the movement on the offensive line was on the interior. Robert Hunt, former Louisiana Raging Cajun, and Damian Lewis, former LSU Tiger, share both guard spots for the Carolina Panthers. Robert Hunt signing a 5-year deal worth $100 million, while the Washington Commanders, not only have they gotten guys from the offensive line, they got a running back in Austin Eckler to sign with them. They got Marcus Mariota as their backup. They signed both Tyler Biadasz from the Dallas Cowboys to be their center, as well as Super Bowl champion from the Kansas City Chiefs as well, Nick Allegretti, absolute Italian. He goes to Washington as well. They get 3 defensive linemen and Dorrance Armstrong, also from Dallas. They get Dante Fowler, and they get Cleveland Farrell, former 4th overall pick. Never has really worked out, but they did get him for a bargain deal. So it's looking pretty good. Plus, they also got Bobby Wagner from the Seahawks. They got Frankie Louvu from the Panthers, as well as from Carolina. They got, on a 1-year deal, Jeremy Chin at safety. Plus, they did get another linebacker in Anthony Pittman. They also got Brandon McManus, who's a solid kicker. Pretty much an upgrade from what was happening before. Plus, they did sign Jamison Crowder, and they signed a special team corner in Jeremy Reeves. It's not like Washington has made huge deals where they're breaking the bank for these guys. A lot of these are bargain deals and are not super committal. I like the direction they're going. I don't think that they're going to make a huge playoff push because they still play in the NFC East, so it's going to be really competitive there. Even though the Giants don't look great, they're still going to put up a fight, and I still expect Washington to improve from being last in the NFC East to moving to 3rd. But still, the direction that they're going in, they may only win 7, maybe 8 games next year. But if that's the case, that's a 3-4 game improvement from what had happened last year. So the fact that they get a new head coach, new OC, new DC, new owner, new regime, new front office, new stadium, they get new everything. Plus, they're just working on their overall roster. Looks a lot better than they did before. A lot of bargain deals. Nothing too committal. Nothing crazy out the park. Really good. I feel like Washington is really winning the offseason right now. Looking at the Chargers, though, I did talk about how Austin Eckler is moving to Washington. Well, they did get Gus Edwards to be their new starting running back. And they also got a pair of tight ends. They got Will Dissly from the Seahawks, and they got Hayden Hurst from the Panthers as well. It is interesting. The fact that they are committing to that offensively, it looks a lot like what we saw in Michigan and with the 49ers back in the early 2010s. A lot of power run, get in your face, grind it out. I know you have Justin Herbert, but even though you're going to go a lot more into that and you're maybe not going to throw as often, you're still going to lead to a lot of play action off of that efficient running because Gus Edwards, even though he's 28 years old, still really looks really good for him with this deal because it's a couple of years, nothing too crazy of a deal. It looks a lot better than what it was before the last couple of years for running back contracts. But even though he's only 28, there's not a lot of wear and tear because he was in a running back backfield where there was a lot of rotation in Baltimore. It was mainly focused on Lamar Jackson, so we still got a lot of tread on those tires. So it's looking pretty good for Gus. Josh Jacobs goes from Vegas to Green Bay, and then because of that, Aaron Jones gets released, and then he signs the next morning with the Minnesota Vikings. So now he takes over Cam Akers and what was going to happen with Alexander Madison's job. DeAndre Swift, since Saquon Barkley did sign with the Eagles, he moved on, and now he's with the Chicago Bears. Tony Pollard moves on from Dallas to Tennessee to be a Titan after Derrick Henry. He moved on as well, and now he's a Baltimore Raven taking over Gus Edwards' spot. And then Zach Moss, he takes the spot of Joe Mixon, who ends up getting traded for a 7th-round pick from Houston, and now Mixon is a Texan. And then because that Devin Singletary takes over Saquon's spot to be a New York Giant. So much rotation. It's hilarious to see. Quite a few upgrades, but then there are also plenty of downgrades from what the running back room was before in terms of talent. But it is interesting because you also look at the wide receivers. The first 2 wide receivers that signed in free agency were Gabe Davis and Devin Duvernay. They both go to the Jacksonville Jaguars, and all of that basically led to Calvin Ridley having to move on and making sure that the Jags don't owe Atlanta a 2nd-round pick. They only end up owing them a 3rd-round pick. But now that Calvin Ridley became a free agent, he ends up signing with the Tennessee Titans as well. He gets a 4-year, $92 million contract. So now the wide receiver room is DeAndre Hopkins, Calvin Ridley, and Treylon Burks as your big 3. If this was just a couple of years ago, it would look so much better. But man, I don't know how I feel about that because Calvin didn't look too great last year. And it's not like Trevor Lawrence is bad, but compared to what you see with Will Levis, I feel like it's a little bit of a downgrade. Still really early to tell what happens with Will Levis in his development, but all the signs are leading towards they're trying to give him as many young-ish weapons and solidified weapons as they can to help him progress and be a competent starter in this league, as well as they also signed Louis Cushenberry to be their new center, so working on that as well. One of the big free agent signings also, I forgot to mention this, was Christian Wilkins. He signs with the Vegas Raiders. So now you have Max Crosby and Christian Wilkins on the defensive line. Oh, man. Hopefully Kansas City is able to block them as well as they can because they did have to move on from a couple of guys. That's going to be tough because you can't really double either of them because even if you do double both of them, that's 4 out of your 5 offensive linemen. Worrying about those 2 alone. What about the other 2 to 3 guys that are going to be either coming on a regular basis, trying to pass rush into the backfield or stop the run, or they send a blitz? That's tough. But no, there's plenty of signings. San Francisco gets 3 guys on the defensive line, more specifically on the interior, as they got Kevin Givens, Jordan Elliott, and Malik Collins. A lot of bargain deals, making a rotation of the interior of the defensive line after they moved on from a couple of guys. Houston, they did move on from Blake Cashman. He signs with Minnesota, and Jonathan Greenard also signs with the Vikings. But they did get quite a few guys out of free agency. The big one to me was Danielle Hunter, edge rusher, former Viking as well. So they almost made a switch, but he's now their star edge rusher along with Will Anderson. Plus they get Danico Autry to be another veteran presence. They signed Jeff Okudah on a 1-year deal to be one of their corners, as well as Mike Ford. Then they got Azeez Al-Shahir, who's a former 49er who worked with DeMeco Ryans back with the 49ers when he was their DC there. Dante Jackson, Patrick Queen, and Deshaun Elliott all signed with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Patrick Queen is the really big one, being a Baltimore Raven, moving on as well into the division, going to be the Pittsburgh Steelers star linebacker. That one's very interesting. I'm intrigued to see how that happens, but because Willie Gay signed with the Saints, going back to that one earlier in this episode, the Saints did move on from Zach Bond, and he signed with the Philadelphia Eagles. The Miami Dolphins signed 3 different linebackers. Same thing with how Washington did, but they got Anthony Walker, Shaq Barrett from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and Jordan Brooks. So a lot of movement there. Quite a few re-signings. More specifically with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, it feels like they're pretty much trying to get the whole band back together as they sign Baker Mayfield back. They get Mike Evans back. They get Antoine Winfield on the franchise tag. They sign their kicker Chase McLaughlin. They get Levante David on a 1-year deal for $10 million. Tyrann Mathieu re-signed with the Saints. Chris Jones signed back with the Chiefs, of course. We were all expecting that. But quite a lot of movement. Quite a few guys as well re-signing with their previous teams. But a lot of craziness, quite a few trades. Deontay Johnson went from being a Pittsburgh Steeler to being a Carolina Panther. So now, even though it isn't the craziest upgraded wide receiver, it's a lot more secure of a pass catcher because of how often he gets open. He gets so many targets he got in Pittsburgh. You kind of expect that to still be the same overall for Deontay Johnson in Carolina. The improved offensive line. You still have that 2-headed backfield with Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders. Looks a little bit better in Carolina. Not saying there's going to be a significant improvement. I still expect them to be last in the NFC South, but it's looking better than it did before. Looking at it from a fantasy point of view, because I have looked more and been more invested in Dynasty, doesn't mean I'm not going to do redraft leagues, but kind of look at it from a long-term perspective. I like Kirk Cousins, of course, going to Atlanta. That definitely helps a lot of the Atlanta pass catchers as well. Russell Wilson going to Pittsburgh. He now has one less weapon to throw to. You still like Jaylen Warren, but the offensive line for Pittsburgh doesn't look great. You now have one less wide receiver out there, so maybe you have to go get one in the draft, but not too high up on that. The rotation of running backs from going from one guy to another, that one's tough because Aaron Jones, he looked good. He still looked good. It feels like he has a little bit of gas left, but in the long term, not too excited for Aaron Jones because he is 28, 29 at this point. Derrick Henry, that one still looks pretty good because there's not as much on him to have to be the focal point of the running game. Now you have him as a complement to Lamar Jackson. You feel good about that. Tony Pollard plus Tajay Spears feels like a good 1-2 punch in the backfield. DeAndre Swift, you do kind of wonder because if they don't stick with Justin Fields, which there's been no movement with Justin Fields, huge quiet market. You see a lot of guys moving on. There's only a limited amount of options at this point. Either you just keep him in Chicago, either send him to New England, or maybe you send him to Vegas and you just let him and Gardner Minshew battle that out and you make sure that he's in the opposite conference. But then there is also Minnesota as an option, but that one just doesn't feel realistic because even though we've seen a couple of trades and a couple of signings of guys going inside the NFC North and staying there and just going to another team, and we've seen it with TJ Hawkinson going from the Lions to the Vikings, are you sure you want to do that with a quarterback? I just think Minnesota stays and goes with a quarterback in the draft, and Justin Fields, it's not looking good for him. It felt like a couple weeks ago maybe he was going to be an Atlanta Falcon, but no, they decided to go with Kirk Cousins. Interesting there. Devontae Parker ends up going to Philadelphia. He's now going to be the wide receiver 3 for the Eagles. Jerry Jeudy, he got traded to the Cleveland Browns. Darnell Mooney, like I had mentioned, he goes to the Falcons. Same thing with Rondale Moore off of that trade with Desmond Ridder with the Cardinals. Mac Hollins, not really big, but he does end up signing with Buffalo since Gabe Davis did move on and go to Jacksonville. And that's pretty much it for the most part. Devin Duvernay, that was not a big one since he's always been more of a special teams guy. He doesn't really get out there wide receiver. But Michael Pittman, he did sign with the Colts. That one is interesting because you are kind of curious. Do you just go with another offensive weapon? You've re-signed a lot of guys on your defensive side. So do you just go for one of your top wide receiver options or go for one of the top pass catching options or running backs in the first couple of rounds? That maybe ruins it a little bit for guys like Josh Downs, who had a pretty good rookie season, but man, makes me think, okay, even though with all these re-signings and guys moving on to new teams, you can't submit anyone as a specific role as of yet because teams could still draft that position in this upcoming draft, and depending on how high or low they go, that may completely change the whole landscape of what you expect in the fantasy world. But as of right now, a lot of guys still look relatively the same, but there was a little bit of movement. Gerald Everett, he also ends up going from the Chargers to go be the backup of Cole Kmet in Chicago. Austin Hooper is now a Patriot, while Mike Gesicki, he moves on from New England to Cincinnati after Cincinnati re-signed Drew Sample to a 3-year deal, and then Zach Ertz, he also signed with the Commanders, but that one is also a low deal. You don't have to worry about it too much. But one thing about the tight end room before I go, Irv Smith, he signed with the Kansas City Chiefs to be behind Travis Kelce on a 1-year deal. It was interesting. If he did venture out more into the market, maybe sign with a different team, he could have been their tight end 1. But if Travis is to move on and retire after this next year or two, you re-sign Irv Smith, and then you make him your tight end 1 after that, and he becomes the heir apparent to Travis Kelce, and you almost just kind of chug along like nothing ever happened. It won't be quite the same, of course, because Irv Smith isn't what Travis Kelce is or will ever be for the most part, but pretty solid replacement, and you already have him in as a low-value contract, nothing too committal. I like that. I like that a lot. If I can get him on the low, if I'm in a dynasty league, okay, I'm gonna try to see what I can do there. But plenty of movement on the interior of the offensive line, a lot of movement in the linebackers, edge rusher and interior defensive line. That had a good bit of movement as well, but you still expect those high value positions: edge rusher, corner, wide receiver, quarterback, offensive tackle, especially offensive tackle. All of those likely going to be the majority of what's going to happen in the first round, as it usually does, but not a lot of movement had it happened for offensive tackle because Morgan Moses, he got traded to the Jets, and then Jonah Williams went to Arizona from Cincinnati. Then George Fant reunites with the Seahawks, and then the Patriots got one of their own guys again, but then Deion Dawkins, he re-signed, he restructured his contract with the Bills, and then the Dolphins restructured and re-signed Teron Armstead to still be their left tackle. So a little bit of movement in the tight end in the offensive tackle market, but you do expect a lot of those top guys to go early on in this first round. Not going to get to my NFL mock draft 2.0 Mesh's mock draft. I'll get to that next week, but if you are curious to see where I have everyone, because there is going to have to be a little bit of changes here and there in this mock draft, you'll be able to check it out on ESPN SouthwestLouisiana.com. I am going to put it in the description, so once this video ends in a couple of minutes, you'll be able to go check that out as well. But before I go, I want to quickly look at the NBA standings. Of course, Boston is still leading in the East at 51-14. But then you look at it, it's a tight-knit race, very tight, because they both have the same record. The Milwaukee Bucks and the Cleveland Cavaliers are both 42-24. Cleveland, the only reason they are number 2 is, of course, because of tiebreakers, as well as they beat the New Orleans Pelicans last night at the time of this recording, 116-95. And then Milwaukee had lost last night, but still very close. Very intriguing to see what happens over this next week. Does Milwaukee reclaim that number 2 seed, or does Cleveland stay in place? New York, the Knicks, they've looked pretty good all season. They're 38-27. Not quite sure that I can trust them to make a deep playoff run based on how their roster is constructed, but one team that I'm really liking that is going to soar over these next couple of years, as I expect, is the Orlando Magic. They were the 4th seed a couple weeks ago. Now they're the number 5, but they're still 38-28, playing a lot better basketball than we're used to, because there's been so many years that Orlando was irrelevant. I always remember them being in the bottom 5 of the Eastern standings year in and year out. It's pretty cool to see them be able to make that jump and change their fortunes. Of course, they do have a lot of young talent. They do have the Wagner brothers. You've got Paolo Banchero. You've got Jalen Suggs. Like, a lot of guys are looking really good. Wendell Carter Jr. as well. They have plenty of guys that are looking really good for them. And I'm excited to see what happens with them in years to come. Miami is still the 8th seed. They're hanging around. Same thing with Chicago and Atlanta. Kind of curious to see who ends up coming out of the 7 and 8 seed in the play-in tournament. But Philly is still kind of, they may end up being there as well, because they're 15 games behind, just like the Indiana Pacers are in the East. So depending on what happens, I know Tyrese Maxey finally came back from that concussion, but man, they are on the cusp of having to play in the play-in tournament after being one of those top 4 seeds for the last couple of years. Crazy what a couple of injuries to your stars does to you in a season. But I mean, that is to be expected. A little bit of movement in the Western Conference, however. Denver is now the number 1 seed at 46-20. 45-20 are the OKC Thunder, but now Minnesota has dropped a couple of spots, and they're the 3 seed at 45-21. Clippers are still hanging in there at the number 4 seed, 4 games behind the Nuggets at 41-23, and then the Pelicans, even though they did lose to the Cavs last night, they're still 39-26, 6.5 games behind Denver. But Sacramento and Phoenix are 7.5 games behind, and then 8 games behind are the Dallas Mavericks. But the Los Angeles Lakers and Golden State Warriors refuse to go away. If they can give themselves a chance, that is worrisome, because being in the 7 and 8, say the Lakers and the Warriors both get in. That is interesting because Minnesota and OKC are both relatively young teams, and depending on how everything ends up by the end of the regular season, you may have to take a couple of upsets if that's the case, because it's always hard to bet against Steph Curry. It's always difficult to bet against LeBron James, no matter how old he is. They always find ways because they have that experience in winning, and these young guys, they're not quite there yet. So that is something to look out for. But man, appreciate you listening in to another edition of Cleats and Sneaks. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on the notification bell. That way you get notified every time we upload any one of our podcasts, not just Cleats and Sneaks, but we also have a couple of other podcasts like the 4-Tire Change with Dawson Isolo and Over Par with Matt Miguez, plus plenty of other local content that we get from the local games that we go to for the LSU Tigers, the Louisiana Raging Cajuns, the McNeese Cowboys. Shout out to them for winning the Southland Conference Tournament. Will Wade in his first year. Crazy turnaround. Absolutely proud of them and what they've been able to do. Of course, New Orleans Saints and New Orleans Pelicans. And the Houston Astros are about to start the 2024 season, so that's something to look out for as well. But until then, talk to you next week.